Good day everyone and welcome to this top 5 list of the easiest PvP builds to play in the Elder Scrolls Online. This video is good for those that are just starting to get into PvP, be it after playing PvE for a while or for new players in general. If you're a new player in general for PvP, I would definitely recommend this beginner PvP guide I made as well. Here I want to go over some specific builds that are really easy to get into if you want to have a comfortable time, some training wheels maybe, to get into PvP, be it in Cyrodiil or in Battlegrounds. I don't want to make this video just for new players though. I also want to add a second component to it, where I want to talk about how to counter these builds. Because many of the easiest builds are also very obnoxious in PvP. If you're 1vxing or at a small scale and you're outnumbered, then these builds are sometimes difficult to deal with. So I want to talk about the tactics that you can use to counter this otherwise obnoxious kind of PvP builds. So in this top 5 of the easiest and most obnoxious build, the 5th place I have saved for the heavy attack sorcerer. This is a very famous and easy spec to play, but in fact it's quite weak and I don't think it's actually worth it as a top 5, but I want to include it anyway because it's got a very strong allure to it. It's a common trap for new players in PvP to fall into. I think this has multiple reasons. It's very common to find in PvE, it is super easy to play. There's also a lot of content creators, both in PvE and in PvP, that I see advising this kind of build. And I also see a lot of talk about it when it comes to questions I receive or comments that I get in Discord or on YouTube. The only thing it can do is just stand in the back and do a mediocre amount of damage to an enemy. You have to leave the real work to people that can be in front of you and actually take damage from the enemy, and that can also deal more burst and stuns and such, while you are just providing a little bit of extra pressure from range. It is outperformed, definitely, even in this kind of aspect, by some of the other builds that I will talk about later on in this video. And the problem is also with its defense. The only thing I often see being used here is Twilight Matriarch. If that bird dies, you also die. It's definitely not capable of surviving any kind of 1v1, except if you're fighting another really bad player. Generally, Sorcerer is also not really a class for beginners. I have tried a couple of beginner setup for Sorcerer, for example with Oaken Soul builds as well. But the problem is that Sorcerer has a very high skill floor and a very high skill ceiling, which means that it's a really difficult class to get into. I do have a lot of builds for it, but it's really nothing intuitive in terms that you can just block and heal like on many other classes. You have to always have a mix of kiting, healing, roll dodging and all that kind of stuff for your survivability. And the burst is also not just you spam one thing or you just do heavy attacks. You always need to have some kind of burst combos, and especially if you get involved with overload as well, that's yet another thing that you need to get used to. So then for the second part, which is how do you counter this kind of spec. As I said, it's not really strong, so it's only a threat when many people attack at once. When it comes to surviving its damage, it's a simple matter of just keeping your heals up, keeping your buffs up, obviously. It's not much damage, and the heavy attack sorcerer does not have much defense either, so I will immediately also go and focus the Sorc instead. It is the weakest beginner class. As I said in 1vx, I always focus it first. It's squishy. In case that they have Twilight Matriarch, I will try and kill that first as well, in case it's a small 1vx with only like 2 people that I'm fighting. In case that it's a bigger 1vx with multiple enemies, I might just try going for the heavy attack Sorc himself and just burst him down really quickly without even caring about the bird itself. There's not much else to say about this spec, so I will just jump to the next one, which is not even a specific build or anything, but more like a class. And I'm talking about Templar, more specifically Magica Templar, though it can also be done with Stamina or Hybrid Templar. Templar is not the strongest class by itself, I've gone over that in my class tier video as well, but it is a very easy and straightforward class. If you're looking for something easy when it comes to survivability, this is really the class that is the most intuitive. You just cast down your AoEs, you keep up your buffs, and then you just stand in it, you block and you heal. And simply doing that in the current meta is going to give you an insane amount of survivability. You will be able to survive the damage from many players this way. You have a purge as well, so you can purge off all proc sets. You have a lot of healing that is ongoing, and especially if you are together with your allies, you are much more difficult to kill than, for example, a sorcerer or a nightblade that doesn't know what he's doing. If you're looking for something easy to help your allies as well, this is also the class to go to. As a PvP healer, this is not the main pick when it comes to really high-end builds, but it is still a good healer build that you can go for, with a lot of support for allies and also some buffs like minor sorcery and such. The damage toolkit is also very intuitive, very straightforward. Jabs is its spammable, you simply spam that and then you make burst mostly with the ultimate, jabs and radiant oppression. And radiant oppression is the part that is obnoxious about this. It's an absolute brain dead skill where you just deal an incredible amount of damage from very far away and it just melts anybody as soon as they are below 50 or 40 or 30% health. It's the best execute in the game and you see a lot of people just going about spamming that. And when it comes to 1vx situations, if the people outnumbering you have somebody spamming that, it has a big influence on the fight. So I want to talk about how to counter this as well. It is similar to the Sorcerer heavy attack in the sense that it is an undodgeable beam, but the problem is here that it hits a lot harder and the class is tankier than Sorcerer. It's much easier for a weaker player to just go and block and heal and survive everything you can throw at them. When it comes to surviving the Radiant Oppression, it's again important to keep all the buffs and the heals up, but even more so than when you fight other classes. And what I mean with that is that you can't take as much risk when you go offensive. When I'm doing a fight, sometimes I will allow a heal over time or a buff to run out just so I can have a few extra seconds of focusing one target. When I'm fighting a Templar that is constantly beaming me together with a bunch of other people that are hammering on me, then I will not take this risk. I will make sure to prioritize keeping my buffs, in case of Sorcerer, keeping my shield up, keeping my health up as well, both for Sorcerer and other classes, and not taking any risks for that. In case that I do happen to be at low health, again, roll cancelling your heals is important, so an animation cancel where you both heal and roll dodge. The same way as with the Sorcerer heavy attack, this is just to avoid all other incoming damage, so it's just the beam you have to worry about, and then you counter that with your heal, so you get your health up, and then as soon as your health is up, the beam does not deal that much damage anymore. Interrupting the Templar that is spamming beam is also an obvious counter. Nothing much to say here of course, but often I do this with simply a stun, so I don't always go and specifically run up to bash or to cast a crushing shock. Sometimes I will also just streak through an enemy on Sorcerer, or I will use shattering rocks on a DK to cancel the continuous beam spam from the Templar. When it comes to killing this class, it's more difficult. As I said, they can just block and heal, and then they can survive for a long time, especially in XV1 situations. You have difficulties trying to burst them down if they're actively defending themselves. So the important part is to attack them when they are not ready for it, when they don't expect it, and when they're not actively defending themselves. Often that's the only way that I can kill these targets to begin with. And you can also use the beam that they are casting as a method of CC to begin with, so you can use the interrupt on that by putting that in your burst combo, and that way dealing a lot of burst damage plus a stun, and that way you might get them down. The next spec I want to talk about is the Nightblade Sniper. I think everybody is familiar with people standing on top of towers and on top of keep gates and such and just sniping ahead at an enemy, and this is a very common spec you see as well. If you have the right build in it though, you can be quite a plague as well when it comes to the target you're focusing. I noticed that specifically in the 1bar Oaken Soul guide that I made some time ago. I tried all classes in 1bar builds back then, and this was definitely the easiest class while still being very effective up to about middle tier PvP. Because you just stand at max range and you dish out a huge amount of constant damage. You don't rely on the enemy being on low health, for example, when it comes to the Templar Jesus Beam, and you also have some ability skills, and if you're good at using those you can get away really quickly and then just go straight back to dealing a lot of damage from maximum range. It's also easy to play a ranged character, so for example when you want to make an offensive combo on a Templar or something like that, it might still be straightforward, but you do need to get close to the enemy with jabs. On this kind of spec it is not difficult, you just spam snipe from range, and sometimes with the Mercer's Resolve and things like that. You have a stun as well if you want to with Magnum Shot. It's not a class, not a spec that is for 1vx, so if you want to do that I wouldn't recommend it. But if you're a beginner PvPer and you want to be effective in a daily battleground, this is definitely an interesting pick to play. It can be fun. I don't find it fun for long because it's also not really engaging in terms of how complicated it gets, but it can be fun to get into. If you are into that kind of play for PvP where you just want to have the Skyrim Archer experience, this is about as close as it gets. So how do you counter this kind of thing? When it comes to survivability, it's important to keep in mind that this is some of the highest range damage spam. It's especially accessible, so it's also common for that. And the only counter to this really is roll cancelling heals and LOS. Roll cancelling heals is the third time I mention it. You might have already guessed it's important to know this, but here too, this will allow you to heal up while also dodging the enemy snipe that is being spammed at you. The problem is that even that will not last forever, because often these people can have more damage than you can tank as well, especially on classes like a sorcerer or a nightblade. It's easier on a class like a warden or a DK. But in the end, if you are in 1vx and other people are hammering on you as well, you will need to go into LOS and somebody is spamming that. If you cannot get to the enemy sniper that is spamming, you have to go to LOS. There's no way to tank it and to keep being in open field. So you need to locate some line of sight, some rock, some tree, and then go to it with mobility skills or just by roll dodging to it, because you will not be able to survive it forever, unlike for example heavy attack sorks or unlike Templar spamming beam by just going above 50% health. That's also where you can think about killing the sniper. If you're not able to do that while you were in open field and you go in LOS, this can sometimes tempt the sniper to go closer to you, to try and go around the LOS and try and target you anyway. And that's kind of the moment where you can go for offense, so you can suddenly come out of your LOS, come in with an ultimate, a stun, things like that, and try and just burst them down. Often these targets are a little squishy because they don't have a full defensive setup for 1vx or anything like that. They're kind of a glass cannon, and they sometimes don't expect a sudden counter. So you can prepare your ultimate, get an LOS, and try and burst them that way. Some of them do expect a sudden counter, of course, especially those that are more experienced at this kind of gameplay. And then what you can also do, and something that I kind of forget myself, is just to bring detection potions. If your resources are fine, this is 100% something worth having a quick slot for as well. It's worth just popping that and then going out of LOS to the nightblade that is just sniping you and countering them. That's a lot more difficult for people to survive, and that's most often also how I can get this kind of player. Next up, as the top 2, I have the proc set Arcanist. Arcanist is the new class, well, relatively new, it's from last year, where its defense is extremely easy because you simply stack a lot of high health and all your heals scale with it. Things like Guard of Freedom and Impervious Rune Ward scale with high health, and that makes it extremely forgiving to play. This is the class where you can get into as a beginner, but also make it really high in terms of how well you perform with it to the end, where also skilled players can play with this class and still do good against any other class. I can't say the same for a Nightblade Sniper, for example, or with a Magicka Templar. But on this class you have an extreme amount of healing, an extreme amount of high health, which makes it easier to survive, both just in raw healing, but also in the amount of forgiveness that it has. Because one of the easiest things to do when you're making mistakes in PvP is simply getting more health. And if you make a mistake, then it's not a big deal. Even if you take like a 5k or a 10k hit where you didn't intend to, likely you'll still be above 50% health or more, and you can just cast one of your very strong health scaling heals and be perfectly fine afterwards. Arcanist also has Guard of Freedom, which is literally a lifesaver, so you can imagine that when it comes to survivability, this class has a lot of fail-safes, where you can make a lot of mistakes and still be fine anyway. When it comes to his damage, that's where the proc set part comes into it. Arcanist does not have much damage by itself, except for some very niche kind of builds. So often they will use proc sets, Master Dual-Wield, Vateshran, Dragon's Appetite, Marselok, Zaan, that sort of thing. And they are a damage carry, so also when it comes to offense, this class is easy, because you simply cast a couple of skills and immediately all your proc sets are doing the damage for you. Proc sets works on other classes too, so definitely when it comes to offense, this is a carry on anything. But I think this class is the easiest one for this, because of how easy its defense is, and on how heavily it relies on them, because otherwise it doesn't have that much damage. I would say the only drawback when it comes to calling this an easy spec is the farm. Many of the sets that I just mentioned, and if you want to get a mythic like Death Dealer's Feet on top as well, which is really good for this class, you will have to go into PvE, you have to do Dragonstar Arena, you have to have the DLCs, you have to farm the mythic, all that kind of stuff, and you will have to get the sets for it. So it can be more difficult to get, but if you have the time and courage to do so, this is definitely also an easy spec to start out with. As for countering this is a harder nut to crack. Unlike the previous builds, this has a high health, just about always if you run it correctly. It also has a lot of damage, continuous damage going on you. When a player with a spec like this attacks you, you are in trouble. You can't simply go in LOS because the dots keep taking on you and they have no problem sticking on you. You can't really kill them as easily because they have a lot of high health and things like a failsafe as well with Impervious Rune Ward and Rune Guard of Freedom. That's also a reason I chose the Arcanist here, specifically for how obnoxious it is to fight this in 1vx. And honestly, there's not much to do about it in this case. That's the unfortunate part about being in a defensive meta. The easiest tactic for me to fight this kind of obnoxious build is to keeping this build as last to kill. Provided that it's a decent player, of course. I kill all the other players first, those with lower health, those with lower skill, and then eventually when it's just an Arcanist remaining, or maybe an Arcanist and one other player, I can try using a very high and long pressure and then a burst combo at the end of that. And an example of that, if I play Sorcerer, is just by having 500 overload and just spamming that guy with 500 overload, and then when he's starting to struggle a little bit, then I'm really going to do an effort of going full in and making the maximum amount of burst to him. If you are on a Templar fighting this guy, you can just go on the offensive for a while, purge the dots and keep on spamming the jabs again and again, and as soon as you notice he's struggling, he doesn't have immovability and maybe his potion's on cooldown, then you can try and ult with 500 ult balorgh and try and do burst that way and then go with Radiant Oppression. Then as the last build, so what I consider one of the easiest builds to play in the game in general, is a max health stacking ranged warden build. Just like the Arcanist I have talked about before, having high health is very safe to play, allows for a lot of mistakes, and Warden is a class that works really well with it too, because of Polar Wind, that you can just spam, and it also has a hot on top of it. It also heals an ally, and generally it is a hard carry for survivability and allows for so many mistakes to be made. The damage on the Warden is a little bit less than, for example, what you can get on a Nightblade or on a Hybrid Sorcerer, but with proc sets such as draugrkin, you can still get a good amount of that. Even if you don't have proc sets, you can still go for some crafted sets such as Rage Vitality, Order Scarf, Shattered Fate, or you can buy Rallying Cry and still get a decent amount of stats to deal a decent amount of damage. Unlike Arcanist, where the sets are a little bit harder to get, this class can go with these crafted sets and still have a decent damage toolkit, because in itself it has a good burst ability that also provides major and minor breach. You can combine it really nicely with an ultimate, you can have other offensive skills that are part of the toolkit and that you can use effectively, and you can also play it ranged. Again, playing ranged is generally easier than playing melee. It's easier for positioning and not having to jump into enemy groups to deal any kind of damage. So that's also a reason I really want to kind of shine a light on this spec, on how easy it is to play and how much I would recommend it if somebody wants to have an easy time in PvP for just trying it out the first time. So as for countering this spec, the obnoxious part here is not really because of the damage it deals. As I said, you can have a decent damage toolkit, but it's nothing extraordinary. It's not like the sniper build that I talked about before, or a Radiant Oppression when you are at 30% health. It's a normal kind of build. So it's not really an issue when it comes to that in 1vx, and usually I will keep this class again for last kill. And that's because the obnoxious part is the survivability. Just like an Arcanist, it's very difficult to burst down a build with 40k health, and when there's still other players in the 1vx as well. They even might act as a healer with Polar Wind, where you just spam it, or other skills such as the Budding Seeds or with the ultimates. In this case, 1vx becomes a lot more difficult in general because it's tough to kill anybody. So what I try to do is to bore the Warden, to just make it boring for him by not really attacking anyone for a while. So that Warden is going to try to go to the offensive as well. Maybe he thinks I'm struggling, maybe he just wants to try and do some offensive abilities on me as well. And that's really when I want to come out of my defensive play and suddenly burst an ally, which is usually Squisher. And while the Warden is casting something offensive or not paying that much attention, I might come out of LOS with an ultimate, things like that, and try to just pick one player off and then go to the next player. Usually I keep the Warden for last, unless if it happens to be a Warden with low health or one that is really not paying attention to what he or she is doing. But keeping it last is kind of a rule that I have for 1vx because it's really tough to kill 40k health in one split second as a single solo player. So when it comes to the tips here, much is the same as what I said for Arcanist. I would basically keep them last and just try and pressure them with the burst at the end to kill them. So that's it for this top 5 of easy/obnoxious builds and how to counter them. I definitely want to make more videos, especially when it comes to tanky builds. I want to do against that. But for now, take this as a newer player. I hope one of these builds might be enjoyable for you. And I hope if you're a 1vx or small scale player, that these tips can be useful in how to pull off a fight like that successfully as well. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!